Your legacy. It's what you're going to leave behind when you leave this world. And the question is, what's it going to look like? Will your legacy be muddled with your estate and your family in disarray and your children not speaking to each other? Or will it be a blessing?
I think all of us as ranch owners want to provide a blessing as a legacy to the next generation and to our lives, and not a burden.
Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute is my guest as we go through 7 considerations in the succession planning of your ranch or estate.
Sometimes hard decisions, as you mentioned, have to be made, but if mom and dad makes those decisions, the heirs may not exactly really like that, but they will respect it.
Each of the 7 considerations we'll talk through, we'll build on the next. It's all the ingredients you'll want to consider if you want your legacy to be a blessing rather than a curse. On this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hi everyone, this is the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. We're glad to have you joining us on our program today. This is episode 130, and it just seems like we kind of keep hitting more milestones as we go along in here. It was November of 2020 when I started hosting the show here, and since that time, we're knocking on the door of 300,000 downloads of the Working Ranch Radio Show, and I cautiously say that because I really don't want that to be something where I'm kind of tooting my horn. What I'm trying to tell you is that I think we've got some programs out there that are extremely relevant to folks, all of us here in the ranching industry. There are programs that I've done, a year or 2 years ago that are still relevant today. That's kind of the purpose of some of the shows that we do, that they do have some legs on them, that no matter when you listen to them, you're going to find some relevance in them. And as a rancher myself here in northeastern Wyoming, a lot of the subjects that we talk about here on the show are just that. Are things that I'm thinking about or that I'm working through here on our ranching operations that we have here. And I figure if it's something I'm dealing with, well, then more than likely other folks across the country are too. So we hope you enjoy that. By the way, it's also important, if you like what you hear or if you have questions or you don't like what you hear, let us know. You can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com and we'll get back to you. We want to hear from you and we appreciate the response out there as well. Today's show is like that. It's on a subject that really is a big issue for a lot of folks in the ranching industry, and that is succession planning. It's always a topic that creates a little bit of consternation within our family ranches in terms of how do we deal with those situations. We do know, and proof is in the pudding here, and that some of these multi-generational ranches that we see that are moving on to 5 and 6 generations, those are happening because those families have pretty much, I guess, so to speak, taken the bull by the horns and figured out some way to pass the ranch on in a way that hopefully doesn't burn too many bridges. That's kind of the key in a lot of this, because as I talked about in the opening, is what's your legacy going to be? What's that going to look like when we go on and our family's here to pick up the pieces? Are there going to be a lot of pieces that they got to pick up and put back together, or is that going to be done for them in such a way that those relationships can stay together and that ranch can be passed on in a healthy way? My guest today, Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute, will be joining us here today. He is a wealth of information and knowledge on this subject as he deals as an ag economist by trade, but also with the Noble Research Institute. A lot of those folks there serve as consultants to many folks across the country. This is a subject that he has seen on many, many occasions, and so bringing us that experience, that knowledge that he has. We're going to be going through 7 different things to be considering when you're looking at ranch succession planning and how to go about that. And some of this is tough. If it was super easy, it probably wouldn't be our show that we'd have because everybody could be doing it. But nevertheless, this is a very tough subject to go through. And I think there's going to be some things you hear today that maybe you're the next generation looking at taking on the ranch or wanting to take on the ranch. There'll be some things in there for you. Maybe you're the one looking at, man, how do I do this? I've got multiple kids, and how do we handle this in such a way that we don't offend anybody or don't hurt anybody's feelings? But sometimes tough decisions got to be made. We're going to be talking about all of those kinds of things today on the 7 things to be considered when you're looking at ranch succession planning. Again, Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute will be my guest here today. Also, as he does in each and every show, meteorologist Don Day will be stepping in towards the bottom of our show to give us a look at our long-term weather and what he is anticipating for weather across the country for the next week or so out. Now, if by chance you have to step away from the radio before we get to the full, you get to listen to the entire show, well, there's a simple solution to that. And if you're familiar with podcasts and any podcast provider out there, we're out there on that. WorkingRanchRadio.com is directly into our podcast site where you can go and you can download the show. You can listen to it on your leisure. Maybe like for a lot of folks, if you're in agriculture, sometimes you're in areas that doesn't have great cell reception or coverage or internet. So you can download the podcast and listen to it on your phone whenever you want to at your particular leisure. Well, let's check in with the Captain Tim O'Byrne, publisher and editor of Working Ranch Magazine. Last week, he was busy getting the next issue of Working Ranch Magazine ready to go and published and sent off. It'll be coming to your mailbox here shortly, but let's check in with the Captain Tim O'Byrne for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. I see President Biden has created another national monument. This time it's 1 million acres in the Grand Canyon area. And the official announcement talks about the wildlife that live in the area and how important it is. And they mentioned bison. And I thought to myself, bison in the Grand Canyon? I'm not too sure that's accurate. I did a little bit of research, and here's what happened. The present-day Kabaib Plateau bison herd originated from the Charles Jesse Buffalo Jones founder herd brought to Arizona in 1906. Arizona Game and Fish Department managed the herd starting in 1929 at approximately 100 bison. Now, that suggests to me that the bison were brought in by an entrepreneur, and apparently they thrived. And I know bison, and they probably got out the first year and they just scattered. And so it got me thinking, why are you lumping this brought in, established bison herd that has only been there 120 some odd years, not even that, and now you're kind of lumping them in with the wildlife thing, and that does not seem right to me. It's just my 2 cents. I'm wondering if anybody's kind of thinking the same thing, because once you set that precedent, then it just goes on and on and on. Anyway, I'll let you folks think about that. Justin, I know you got a great show lined up for everybody, so hit it.
All right, thanks, Captain. And yeah, I think the real concern that you're alluding to there is, what's the precedence that is being set now when we can take a herd of bison that was introduced into that area and now throw them in the lump of wildlife to be protected in this new national monument down in the Grand Canyon area. So a real concern, because where else then could they take that mindset and go to other places of the country and start to incorporate introduced species that were not natural to that area now as being protected. So I think there's just a lot of concerns with that, and I think you're dead on to bring that to our attention here today. Now, to kind of make maybe kind of lighten the mood just a little bit, so I guess if you're going to go to the Grand Canyon area, just remember, as Roger Miller says, you can't roller skate through a buffalo herd. So I guess on that note, let's do a quick thank you to our sponsors here today of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Vitalix, livestock is your livelihood. Tubs are our expertise. Vitalix, the True Blue Tub. Find out more at Vitalix.com. And Inherent Select from Zoetis, providing commercial cow-calf producers with genetic insights to make replacement female selections and breeding decisions. Find out more at InherentProgress.com. And the American Gelbvieh Association, a highly fertile, moderately framed cow that raises high-performing calves even in tough environments. Now that's doing more with less. The Gelbvieh cow's efficient use of resources make her the picture of sustainability in today's today's modern beef industry. Find out more at gelbvieh.org. And Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring system, all from the convenience of your phone, powered by solar, satellite, and cell. Keep an eye on your water supply with the daily text. Call Metalark Solutions today for tank monitors, well controllers, generators, and more. Find out more. Give them a call at 802-252-6135 or head to their website at tanktoad.com. It's what we use here on the X-Ring Ranch, and tell them you heard it here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Well, stay with us. Coming up next, Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute joins us as we go through the 7 things to consider when we're talking ranch succession and planning. We'll be back on the Working Ranch Radio Show after this.
There are lots of nutrition tubs out there, but none can match the true blue commitment of Vitalix. Our tubs offer you the most concentrated nutrition at the lowest cost per day. That means more profit for your operation and improved performance for your cow herd. In fact, research shows Vitalix tubs increase feed efficiency by 20%, while boosting conception rates, herd health, and weaning weights. Learn more at Vitalix.com. Vitalix, the true blue tub.
And welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills as we continue now and head into our featured interview for today. And when we get into this particular issue, this is no doubt a very, probably I would consider to be one of the bigger issues when it comes to ranching for family ranches. And that is, who's going to take over the ranch? What is the succession plan? Joining me here today is Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute. He is an ag economist, but for a lot of folks there at the Noble Research Institute, serve as consultants to a lot of folks across the country when it comes to various different ranching issues. Today, Dan, we're glad to have you joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate the invitation. Looking forward to it.
Well, this, as I said, as I started out this particular segment, we've said earlier in the show, this is a big issue for our ranching industry. And I know you deal with a lot of different ranchers across the country, but no doubt probably one of the biggest issues that comes across your desk, I'm guessing.
It is, Justin. You know, the age of the average rancher in America continues to get older every year, and that's a good thing. But the baby boomer generation, which I'm a part of, is getting close to retirement and looking for someone else, hopefully a family member, coming on to take the operation over. And so there's going to be a lot of ranching operations transition to the next generation, whether it be family or non-family members. But a large portion, I'm going to say, in the next 10 to 15 years is going to change management during that time period.
You know, and Dan, too, one of the things in this, and I even find it in my own self, I'm still a ways off from where we're going to be transitioning my operation to the next generation. But at the same time, also getting into a mindset of thinking, you know, we're going to be putting, and I need to be considering putting things into place, into practice that I may never see the benefits of. You know, in terms of it's not something that is going to affect me while I'm living. It's going to be something for the next generation. That in itself is kind of a real mindset to get through.
Well, you know, many of us have worked hard at putting an operation together, and, you know, we're somewhat attached to it beyond it just being a business. It's, you know, we kind of consider it a way of life. And so, you know, the challenge we have with that are owners of these operations today, the next generation or someone else doesn't always share the same passion and the same commitment and dedication for running a ranching operation as we do. I mean, they've not been there to put the quarter sections together or the different properties together or the mix of enterprises that we now have come up with. And so having the next generation share that same passion is somewhat of a challenge. And I know there's younger people out there with that same passion. We just have to find them. Yeah.
And I think too, Dan, one of the things you deal with in some of that is the generation that might be in control of the estate right now, ultimately in control of the estate. It took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get to where they're at. And I think there's some element of that, of does the next generation taking that over appreciate that?
Very, very good observation. And two, as we've worked hard to put these operations together, the owners today, that, the investment that we have is much greater with the increase in land values, and equipment is cost, cattle's hired today. And just the size of a ranching operation today is such that it requires some real business management skills, in my opinion. This generation have kind of grew up growing with those increased demands. And it is hard to, if you've got, 5 million, 10 million, 30 million kind of ranching operations, giving control of that much financial assets is hard for some of the current operators. And, there's a huge difference in, transferring assets to the next generation versus transferring a business. It takes a lot longer. It takes a lot of planning to transition that business to where you want it to be successful. As you accurately mentioned there, many of the owners and operators today have put a lot of blood, sweat into these operations and wise decisions to get them where they are today. And it's hard to give the reins up to someone that hadn't went through that much effort, as you mentioned.
So our program here today, as we've kind of introed this and kind of set the foundation for what we're going to be talking about and a little forward discussion here, is going through about 7 steps that you guys have put together in some ways, or some things for considerations when folks are looking at some succession type planning. The first one I'm going to start out here, and I find this interesting because I think this ultimately is a very pivotal point in the succession planning, is to think about your legacy. What are you wanting to leave behind? That is step one, and I feel that really is very foundational and very pivotal to start off with.
Well, I think all of us as ranch owners want to provide a blessing as a legacy to the next generation and to our lives, and not a burden. And so I think that's the process we have to think through is not binding the next generation to something that we feel near and dear hearts. We want to bless them and not burden. We say, well, you can't sell any land, or you have to do this, or we tend to want to manage the operation from the grave. Yeah. And sometimes, I wanted to say often, but I'll just say sometimes, that really creates a burden. It limits flexibility and creativity in the next generation that may need it in order to survive. And so that legacy that we want to leave, I think, for most of us, is a blessing. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish between that legacy of a blessing and a burden, just because we don't want anything to happen to the operation. We've operated it successfully, but if we lived another 40 years, we may not be successful doing the same thing we've done for the last 40.
So then it moves us into the second thing. And as I went through these 7 things, I find that it's interesting because they're almost purposely, well, I know they're purposely in order, because the next thing is to have tough conversations. And I come to that point really from 2 sides. I've got my family side where my folks have passed away, and realizing the importance that some of these tough conversations need to happen now, because they won't happen in a very good way once the parents are gone. And I think those tough conversations are good for both sides. It's good for the kids, it's good for the parents, all in all, but at the same time, it's a tough conversation.
Just as you started the radio broadcast today, Justin, you kind of told your audience, well, this is what we're going to talk about today. And you set somewhat of what their expectations are going to be for this radio broadcast. And the same thing applies when we're thinking about that transition is if we can help manage the next generation's expectations of what's going to happen in the future, then there's a much likelier chance of success. And because if you've got children or grandchildren that don't want to have any part of the ranching operation, the sooner you know that, the better, because you may have said, well, I got 3 grandsons and, they all have fun when they come and they enjoy being here. But it's really hard in today's work environment to attract these young kids back to a ranch where, it may be 20, 30, 50 miles from the nearest Walmart. And these sons and daughters get married, and sometimes their spouses have different ideas, and you've got to respect that. And so if you can have that conversation earlier rather than later, it will give you much more planning time to address some maybe issues that you didn't think you had. And so early communication, often communication, and we encourage that communication period not to happen at, well, everybody's home at Christmas, so we'll talk about what's going to happen to the ranch. And usually that's not a good time to have those kind of conversations. It's best just to schedule one and invite some, your family either to the ranch. You can have it off site, but communication is so important in planning that transition of the ranch to the next generation.
You bet. This conversation, our topic here today, I know is going to hit home for a lot of folks. Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute is my guest here today. We are talking succession planning. We still have a lot to talk about. We're going through 7 things that they suggest folks to kind of go through when you're considering succession planning and how to go about in that process. We've covered a couple things. We're going to continue on when we return here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. A sustainable ranch is one that can do more with less. And for beef producers, it can start right at the herd level with a cow that's efficient with her resources and environment. And in today's modern industry, Gelbvieh females are the picture of sustainability. Gelbvieh and Balancer cattle are early maturing with maternal superiority through increased longevity, added fertility, and more pounds of calf wean per cow exposed. Adaptable, versatile, and sustainable. All factors that have a positive impact on your bottom line. Gelbvieh influenced females, the smart, reliable, and profitable maternal choice for achieving sustainability in today's modern beef industry. Be sustainable, breed Gelbvieh. Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. My guest today is Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute. He is an ag economist there. Also, for a lot of those folks there, of course, they serve as consultants to ranchers all across the country. We are talking about considerations that you might be needing to think about on passing the ranching operation down to the next generation, some steps and things to be considering in that. And we've already covered a couple things, 2 very pivotal, very foundational things. For example, is what kind of legacy do you want to leave when you leave behind? And then also, we were just, as we finished up the last segment, having those tough conversations. That's something that needs to occur not only for the kids or the next generation, but also for the parents as well. Dan, as you were talking about that, before we get into the next step that we're going to be looking at, just a side note on that. And when we talk about having those tough conversations, I think part of that also is what are some realistic expectations that need to come out in those tough conversations. That in itself needs to be considered. I guess one of the things I think about is that if the default is to split the place up equally among the siblings, that may not always be the best from a management element for that operation. So there has to be some realistic conversations, realistic expectations in those tough conversations.
That's a great point, Justin. And I always try to remind the ranchers I work with that are planning a transition of the ranch to realize that even though maybe a decision is made or in the communication process, that sometimes hard decisions, as you mentioned, have to be made. But if mom and dad makes those decisions, the heirs, kids, grandkids may not exactly really like that, but they will respect it.
Yep.
And so mom and dad, really has a responsibility when there's like undivided interest concerns or who gets this or who gets that, if there's not one heir that's going to really take on the whole operation. And so if mom and dad can just make those hard decisions while they're alive, the kids may not like it, but they will respect it. And too many times I've seen siblings try to make those decisions on their own and wind up really only speaking to each other through their attorneys for the rest of their lives. And that's such a sad situation. And it gets back to what we mentioned earlier about, I think all parents want to bless their heirs and not burden them. And so that's a result of those communication efforts, those having those hard decisions and trying to manage the expectations of the next generation or two. And so it's just paramount, I think, for a successful transition plan to include that communication piece early on if they can. So.
Yep, very well said. And I think these tough conversations might have more of an impact on the legacy, the first thing we talked about, too, in some ways. So let's get to the next step here. We've still got about 5 more to go here. Identifying the successor is one of the steps. And again, this is a tough situation. This is tough sometimes, especially when you got multiple family members. But that's one of the steps that needs to happen.
Exactly, Justin. And again, sometimes there is not a family member that agrees to be a successor. And as disappointing as that might be to mom and dad, again, if that family member that mom and dad had planned to be the successor does not want that, and they learn of that in a reading of a will, or when the trust documents gets opened as a surprise, then what chance of the business of ranching, what chance does that has to be successful when you got a successor that does not want to be a successor? And sometimes having that conversation and identifying that successor exposes some information and some preferences of heirs that maybe mom and dad didn't realize existed. And so it's so important to identify that successor as early as possible, because we talked briefly earlier about the difference between transferring and transitioning a business versus just, say, ranch assets, because that successor, unless they've been working in the ranch, on the ranch for a number of years, and possibly, even then, if that successor has not been involved in making some of the business decisions, the risk management decisions, the marketing decisions, the credit decisions, that they've just been feeding the cows and making sure that they get bred and during the production issues of the operating the ranch, then they've had no exposure to the business, and that's very important if it's going to be successful into the future. Well, and I know this is not the show we're going to get into it, but I do want to point folks to episode 115. It was a legal perspective on estate planning that I did with Dal Houston. He actually is also out of Oklahoma as well, an attorney out of Oklahoma. But he really talked about some of the business side of transferring the estate. Business, transferring the business versus the assets and some things like that. That's not something we're going to get in here today, but it kind of touches in this particular subject. Dan, you talked a little bit about the business side of it. Well, then let's get into the business side, because we really need to be looking then at what are we passing on? Are we passing on a business, or are we passing on a hobby? Because that was a subject that I've brought up at different times as ranchers, because I really push us as a ranching industry that we need to be profitable. We need to be doing things in a way that we see sustainability in a long-term standpoint with passing these ranches to the next generation. So when we look at that from a business side of things, we need to get into the books side of this and look at the profitability of the ranch. Great question and observation, Justin. 2 different situations come to mind quickly as you bring this subject up, as to where there's a couple of situations where the parents were very successful business people in a different industry. And they had sizable ranches that really were hobbies to them. I mean, they had built nice residences there. They were kind of went on weekends and got to enjoy the country life and the fresh air. But they were being subsidized quite heavily. And so when that conversation come up with the next generation about, well, are you going to take this on? Are you going to operate as a business? When the books were opened up and the next generation realized, hey, you're subsidizing this operation, but the next generation's got to understand if the ranch is profitable, and how profitable can it sustain me at the standard of living that I'm used to or want to have. And so that information has got to be known by the succeeding operator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And that's some of that stuff's a little tough, as a lot of these things are. Our second point was having those tough conversations. I think all of these can be tough in some ways. My guest today is Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute. He is an ag economist there and a consultant. We are going to continue on. We're talking about succession planning here. We've got a couple more steps to be in consideration of. We're going to talk about them and continue on when we return here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Every year you pick your replacement heifers. Some become profitable cows. Others disappoint. How can you make more reliable selections? Genetic testing. Commercial cow-calf producers like you are using Inherit Select from Zoetis. You gain valuable predictions, including cow fertility, size and soundness, feed efficiency, growth and carcass merit, as well as easy-to-use economic indexes. This improves your selection, breeding, and marketing decisions. Request a call from inheritprogress.com and ask about free TSUs to get you started.
And welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills as we continue with our topic here today, as it's on a tough subject for a lot of us, and it's a subject that every ranch family is probably going to have to go through at some point, or if they haven't already, and that is on succession planning. And it all started as we began here today. One of the first steps is, what is the legacy that we want to leave behind? And my guest today, again, is Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute. He's an ag economist there. And Dan, we've had some great discussions here. As we get into these next steps, one of the things is this next one is assemble a team. And I think that's one thing that really causes some hesitancy with folks, is because, oh my word, it's so expensive for, an attorney and then an accountant and then putting all that together. And I can come from my own family's background here. It can cost an awful lot of money. It can actually, I can tell you, it costs more money to do it wrong than to do it early before and get it done right. That's my experience in that particular deal. But when we talk about putting together a very knowledgeable team, expand on that just a little bit.
Well, I think that the challenge that many of us have as retiring ranch owners and operators is the fact that throughout our lifetime, we've kind of learned to be an electrician and a plumber and a mechanic and a veterinarian. And,
Yeah.
we wear many hats,
Mm-hmm.
and we kind of only hire things done when it becomes a necessity and we can't do it ourselves. But when it comes to planning your estate and planning to who's going to operate the farm next, those generally are skills and knowledge that many of us don't have. And so to your point about it's a lot cheaper to get it done right the first time than it is to try to fix it the second or third times. And so assembling a good attorney and a tax practitioner. And I'm gonna kind of emphasize one word here as we share that. And that word is, when I encourage people to hire an attorney or a tax practitioner, I encourage them to hire someone that's competent in agricultural issues, because all CPAs and all attorneys are not created equal. Some of them are very good experts and skilled in oil and gas, or Schedule C businesses, or international work, and they have their own expertise. And so agriculture is a unique animal. And so I would just encourage people to definitely assemble them a team. Maybe their ag lender, an attorney, a tax practitioner, but all of them, I would say, needs to be competent in agricultural issues because they are somewhat unique. And so sometimes it may be like some of us, we say in the country, like finding hen's teeth. It's rare, but definitely put together a team. And yeah, writing that check is hard to do. But that's their profession. They keep up with it. And especially as we're entering the next few years, that, the current tax law is going to change. Is going to expire at the end of 2025. And so, maybe the best made plans today will not be the best made ones in 2026. That could all change. We can't predict or outguess what Congress is going to do, but we do know that the current legislation as we know it today is going to expire. And so there's even a greater need to assemble that team, that competent team together to keep you abreast of and knowledgeable of the latest tax legislation and the tax issues.
Well, and that leads us right into our next step here, and that's revisit your plans. And once this is set, it's not something you just tuck away in the deal. I mean, great, it's the biggest hurdle has been done, but at the same time, it does require every couple of 3 years or so pull that back out, make some changes or modifications that need to be done as well. So revisiting the plans is a good step as well.
Exactly. Great point, Justin. And, people's lives change in addition to tax legislation. And, people die, people get married, kids get born, and life happens. And that's a good thing. And so just kind of one and done attitude about preparing a will or a trust or creating an LLC is, you might think, well, we breathe a great sigh of relief and say, wow, I'm sure glad that's done. We've been needing to do that for a long time, and you need to be proud of getting that all done the first time, because a lot of times, we learn so much just going through the process. And again, that goes back to assembling a good team and having that communication. And if we can keep things transparent and out on the table and having competent advisors, a dreadful process becomes a lot easier because we know we've got good information. We know we're communicating with our heirs who we want to bless. We're making good decisions and we're keeping abreast of changes. And, that's really all a person can do for his family. And again, if mom and dad can make those decisions rather than letting the siblings do it. And I've heard too many times as mom and dad say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to let the kids worry about it, which in my opinion is the very worst thing they can do, because I've seen families when that's happened that siblings, it splits them up, unfortunately, that everybody wants the same asset. And when they're left to make those decisions themselves, it usually turns out to be a less than an ideal situation.
Yep, that's exactly for sure on that one. Yeah, just one final step here in this, and that was get going. Get started on it. The worst thing we can do is listen here today and say, what they said, I 100% agree with. That's a great idea. And then just kind of forget about it and don't ever move forward on it. But getting started on it is the last step and kind of critical to make sure this happens.
They say, I've always heard that 75% of getting anything done is just getting started on it. And so I would encourage people, the very first step, is to inventory your ranch. Be realistic about it. Don't say, well, all that land just worth $1,000 or $500 or whatever, write it down, know what the value is, add up all the equipment, livestock, your CDs, your investments, whatever they are, add them all up, come up with a number. And also in that process, when there's titles involved, whether it's vehicles, equipment, especially land, know how that's titled. Is it in joint tenancy with right of survivorship? Is it sole proprietor? Is it tenants in common? How are those assets owned? And you can make your time with your team of advisors much more productive, much more efficient if you do some homework beforehand. But yeah, so many times we go to seminars and conferences, we read books, and we learn about trust and wills and the tax exemption levels and all these things. And then we go back home and we get busy baling hay and fixing fence and plowing and planting, and we don't engage. And so, you gotta make that first step.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Dan, I think this has been good. We're about to shut things down here for this conversation here today, but I sure appreciate you coming on, because I think, as I've said, and I continue to say this is a very, very large issue to our industry, especially when we look, as you said, when we started our conversation here today, the average age of the American farmer rancher out there is setting up in such a way that we are going to see transitions that are happening and need to be happening at some point in time. So it is a very, very big issue. And for me, it's a big issue for two reasons. One is because I have going through this. And the second thing is because I want to see these family ranches continue. I mean, you can take the word sustainability and you can put it in every element of our ranch, whether you want to talk about soil, whether you want to talk about your livestock, or whether you want to talk about your practices of it. But I also think about it in terms of sustainability for the long term of our industry as a whole, getting it to the next generation. So I think it's extremely important. And as you head out here today, just some final comments from you on this subject.
I would say that we like to see families transition to the next generation. I do. And we sometimes look at ranches that century-old ranches, or they're in their fourth generation. I'm a fifth generation rancher. And those doesn't happen by accident. It takes planning. It takes dedication. It takes sacrifice. It takes mom and dad talking about some things that they just normally don't talk about. And that's difficult for them. You can't just ice it over and say, well, go do this, because it's hard for them. It's not something we do each and every day, to have these kind of conversations with the younger generation. And so if you want that, your ranching business, and I emphasize business on that, to continue on, you can't say, well, I'm just going to give the ranch to son Joe or grandson Tom, and it happened. You've got to train them, to help them to be successful. And with your mentoring, and it takes a production and marketing cycle or two in order to get them up to speed for them to have the best chance of success. So the more planning, the more time we have to mentor that next generation to help them be successful that we want them to be, the earlier start, the better.
Mm-hmm. You bet. Well, Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show, a topic that, as I've said, is very, very important to our industry. And I appreciate your knowledge in this, your experience in this, and your words here today to kind of guide us through some of these steps.
It's been a pleasure for me, Justin. And again, thanks for the invitation. And I hope as a result of this, there's at least one person, and I hope more, that goes out there and starts to work in their transition plan. Yeah.
Well, and one thing I want to point out too is, before we get too far here, if folks have questions about this, I know you guys have a lot of experience in this. How do they get a hold of you guys?
Our website is noble.org, www.noble.org. So you can visit there. Our contact information, you can call in there, and we'd be happy to engage and help you achieve your succession planning goals.
You bet. Well, Dan, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Yes, sir. Appreciate the invitation, Justin.
And again, my guest today, Dan Childs with the Noble Research Institute, joining us here today, giving us a lot to think about, working through those 7 steps, each one building on the next. And as he said there at the very end, it's get started on it. It's never too late to get started on this. And as I had brought up earlier in our conversation, from my own experience, I can tell you right now that once mom and dad are gone, it is a whole lot harder to do this kind of stuff. And it's a lot easier if mom and dad can be a part of this and be willing to rely. What I feel is going to be very important in the legacy they leave is how they make this transition happen in such a way that the ranch can be sustainable in the long run, and more than importantly probably is that the relationships with family members are sustainable as well. Stay with us. Meteorologist Don Day joins us next as we take a look at our long-term weather. We'll be back on the Working Ranch Radio Show after this.
Do you have a young child, grandchild, niece, or nephew that loves the weather and wants to learn more? Day Weather has produced a children's weather journal full of weather facts, fun weather experiments, coloring pages, and pages to record weather observations for every season of the year. The weather journal is for ages 3 to 7 and designed to be fun and educational. The interactive weather projects are fun for the whole family to take part in. For only $10, the Day Weather Journal is a great gift idea for any occasion. Click on our Amazon link to order at dayweather.com.
And welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. Justin Mills here with you as we continue now with taking a look at our long-term weather. Joining us is meteorologist Don Day with a look at our weather. And, you know, Don, just our particular country, and I know we try to cover the whole area when we talk long-term weather here on the show, but we've been abnormally cool here, and I'm not complaining by any means. But one of the things we're seeing, and you say that as we look into the rest of August, we could continue to see this trend, is some of the Pacific fronts that's pushing those lows down into the U.S. is going to continue to maybe make our northern part of the U.S. a little cooler, southern part warmer.
Yeah, what we're seeing is a pattern that we tend to see in late August, where we start to see the jet stream up in those higher latitudes of Canada and across the North Pacific get a little more active, a little more busy, and there's good reason for that. By late August, you start to have much shorter days and longer nights up there, and you start to cool things off. And that tends to start to produce more fronts and a more active jet stream. But it seems to be off to about a 2 to 3 week start a little bit earlier. And so we're seeing these vigorous Pacific fronts. And in this past week, we had one of those go across British Columbia, Alberta, then across the central and northern Rockies and in the Midwest. And it cooled things off and brought a lot of severe weather. But what these fronts are doing, and we do see more of them coming through. We've got one this weekend. We've got another one the middle to the end of next week. This is going to mean the northern tier of the U.S. From the eastern parts of the Pacific Northwest through the Great Lakes and then across the Corn Belt, then into the central and western high plains. Temperatures are going to cool down with these fronts. There'll be warm-ups between them. But the warmth, the heat in the desert states and the southern plains is going to kind of stay bottled up. When these fronts come through, there will be an expansion of the heat northward, only to get beaten down again. So we'll continue with the heat from Florida to Texas and across the desert Southwest, but it's going to be suppressed into those areas. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the country, really, 70% of it, is going to be affected by this more active northerly jet stream.
Mm-hmm. As you look into the next month or so out, do you see anything in our weather pattern that's going to shift a bit and maybe take some of this relief off of the south part of the country that's seeing severe heat? Do you see anything looking ahead that could shift that weather pattern a bit?
Well, a little bit. I mean, when these fronts are coming through, they're knocking that heat a little bit more south every time. But that southern high is going to be stubborn through the rest of the month and into early September. Now, eventually, these fronts are going to start to win out as you just start to get them stronger. Where I do see relief is maybe for the southeastern United States, for I think Kansas, Oklahoma, parts of eastern Texas are going to catch some of these cool fronts coming on through. But we also see, to look at, the heat, I think the worst of the heat this summer is probably over. There will be some resurgence of it towards the second half of August in the desert Southwest. But I think we're kind of at that time of year where the real significant heat waves that the South has seen this year, I think they're done. That's not to say that we've got some hot weather to go through, but I do see the end of August into early September, these frontal systems, being active. So what that's going to mean is that we're going to have probably an early start to fall across a good tier of the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the things, and when I'm in conversation with folks, is as we've seen specifically the northern tier of the country, we'll maybe use the I-70-80 corridor as our north-south split in there, but wondering with the coolness that we have seen in the northern tier of the country, is that foretelling of a severe winter?
Well, it's hard to make direct connections between, let's say, a cool summer and a severe winter. One thing that that we do tend to see, I think the connections are much easier to say that a wet spring will usually mean a cooler summer. And certainly that's been the case this year. As we change into the fall season, what makes a summer cool and wet does not necessarily the same pattern make let's say a harsh winter.
Sure.
Just because there's a lot going on with the shorter nights and the longer days and the changing sea surface temperature conditions. There's a lot of moving parts. However, with that being said, we're getting some pretty significant indications, some signals, strong signals, let's just say, that do point to a colder winter across a large part of the United States, and one that is likely going to be snowier as well. If we rewind to last winter was really centered in terms of the harshest winter conditions in the West and the far Southwest. A lot of the middle part of the country and the East Coast really did not have a severe winter at all. This winter, I think, is going to be more spread out. I guess the winter love will be dispersed for more folks. So the harsher winter conditions will cover more geography this winter. It may not be necessarily centered so concentrated like it was last year, but more spread out.
Yeah. Well, good and bad to that. As I've always said, it's always nice for us when we have more of an open winter. It's a little cheaper to winter cows on grass that way, but we do need moisture too. So it's kind of a catch-22. And I guess if I could pick, let's just say, let's have a nice open winter till about February. And then if it needs to snow in March and April, we'll handle it then, right?
Well, you should have told me that a week ago, then I would have got your order in time.
Okay. That's how that works. That's how that works. I didn't even think about that. All right. Well, I'll take one to go, and we'll see what we can do.
There you go.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us with a look at our weather.
Thank you.
You bet. And again, that is meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. If you want to tune in each and every morning to take a listen to his video podcast, complete with pictures and everything, it gives you a pretty good idea of what the weather outlook is for across the country. You can go to his website at dayweather.com. It's also where you can go if you're looking maybe for some weather stations or other weather paraphernalia things that he's got on there. You can go to his website as well and take a look at what he's got there. Well, stay with us. Coming up next, I'm going to give you an idea of what's in store for next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Speaking of weather, hint, hint, stay tuned. I'll tell you what's coming up on next week's show and others we're working on when we return here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. A sustainable ranch is one that can do more with less, and for beef producers, it can start right at the herd level with a cow that's efficient with her resources and environment. And in today's modern industry, Gelbvieh females are the picture of sustainability. Gelbvieh and Balancer cattle are early maturing with maternal superiority through increased longevity, added fertility, and more pounds of calf wean per cow exposed. Adaptable, versatile, and sustainable. All factors that have a positive impact on your bottom line. Gelbvieh influenced females, the smart, reliable, and profitable maternal choice for achieving sustainability in today's modern beef industry. Be sustainable, breed Gelbvieh. Well, coming up on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, if you clued in on the hint that I left you in the last segment, you probably are thinking Don Day. Meteorologist Don Day will be our guest next week with his new updated long-term weather outlook for the fall and winter for North America. And he'll also be telling us about a YouTube video that he'll have out in conjunction with that. So be sure to tune in next week. Also, later on in shows that we're working on, Oklahoma State University will be talking with those folks on their research project on virtual fencing, and the King Ranch Institute will be in here as we're going to be talking with them about what are the skills that ranch managers need to possess in today's modern industry. So all those coming up here on future shows. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. You can get your subscription started today by going to workingranchmag.com. Join us next week. I'm your host, Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.